Aho, my relations. Welcome to another program, Eagle and Condor. This is Tony Gonzales, your host today, and my relatives. For today's program, I had interviewed Miguel Gavlian Molina to talk about his life experiences, and as a DJ, a host, radio person on KPFA. He's been on the radio KPFA La Onda Bajita well over 40 years. In the interview, he'll talk about his life, beginning with radio KBBF in Santa Rosa. So Miguel is well known across the country. He's almost like Wolfman Jack in terms of a voice on a Friday night. Can you imagine that? So let's listen into his life story and how he has inspired the youth, the young people, all these 40 years. People have grown up with his voice. But my relatives, before we get into that interview, I want to mention Leonard Peltier. He's very sick. He's been in prison pretty near 49 years, and for a crime he did not commit. But check out his website, Free Leonard Peltier Now, my relatives. And across the country, we're all aware Leonard is having his parole hearing on Monday, June the 10th. And we're asking everybody to make a prayer circle in your community and pray hard that the results of the parole board will be positive and Leonard will be free. The parole board will render a decision in 30 days, within 30 days. So hopefully sometime in July, Leonard will be coming home. The last time he had a parole hearing was in 2009, and he can't wait for another parole hearing in 10 or 15 years, whatever date they tell him to come back. It's got to be now. Another way to do this is call the White House, leave a message with President Joe Biden at area code 202-456-1111. That's 202-456-1111. Call every day, Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, my relatives. And as I said, in San Francisco, we're having a vigil on Monday, June the 10th. And we invite everyone to come and say prayers for Leonard Peltier. It'll be at the Department of Justice in San Francisco, 450 Golden Gate Avenue. And it's from 11 to 2 p.m., 11 a.m., 2 p.m. Bring a brown bag. We're going to have multi-denominational speakers, drum, and sage. And we invite everyone to think about Leonard Peltier. It's time he come home. All right, my relatives, let's go into that video interview with Miguel Gavlian Molina, KPFA person of many degrees. Greetings, my relatives. Welcome to Eagle and the Condor. And today, my relatives, a very special occasion. I have the great pleasure of introducing to some of you, but most people here in the Bay Area, Channel 29 and throughout, and listening to the World Wide Web on KPFA. We have Miguel Gavlian Molina. I've taken the opportunity, having the time with him today, to request an interview. However brief it may be, my relatives, we'd like to continue, not necessarily a series, but a wider discussion about Miguel Molina, his life, and talk about some of the achievements. One of which, to acknowledge his persona on radio, and that in particular with KPFA in Berkeley 94.1 FM, but Miguel also having his beginnings with KBBF in Santa Rosa. So that brings him back 50 years, my relatives, of history that we'll be talking to him about, including fast forward to September 16th, but it has particular significance to the Chicano movement and throughout Aztlan, indeed California and the Southwest, Miguel Molina, and the message and the voice he brings forward continuously on Friday nights. And that is the state legislature through the introduction by Assemblyman Simon Salinas, of, I believe, the 28th district, but the support from the assembly members throughout the proclaimed September 16, 2005, acknowledging La Onda Bajita, the KPFA radio program that Miguel provides, bringing the voice from the bottom up. In particular, a lot of emphasis on the farm worker community, which brings us much more in the field in education and incarceration, youth, and restorative justice, my relatives. But for the moment, having Miguel here, I'd like to introduce him, speak for himself on some of his work and projects that he's also involved in, and we hope to continue this discussion further. But welcome Miguel Molina Gavilan to the show, Eagle and Condor. And if you would please introduce yourself. I've known you, I don't know if maybe you can be more exact on the decades, but please.
Thank you, Ton, for having me on the show here. Well, basically, our relationship goes about 45 years. And I've been doing the version of La Onda Radio del Barrio Aztlan. And La Onda means the wave of the Barrio Aztlan for 43 years. But I started the show originally called the Low Show Profile at radio station KPFA in Santa Rosa, the Bilingual Broadcasting Foundation, 89.1 FM, back in 1973. So this show has been cruising for 50 years, so half a century. And when the State Assembly acknowledged La Onda and declared the 16th of September as La Onda Bajita Day in the state of California, it was unanimously supported by the Assembly and recognized as the longest running Chicano Indígena show in public community radio in the country. So that's a milestone. The fact that we've been on for 50 years is another milestone. And that kind of tells you where I'm at. We're all at this point dinos, or we're from the Jurassic era, but we're still here. And the intent of the show has always been to bring light to the plight of Chicano, Indígena, and our plight in this country, our struggle for human rights, and to regain our humanity. Because this government, as it is, it's a colonial system and has denied us our humanity. That's why we cover the United Farm Workers. We've been doing that for 50 years. We cover youth involved in gang warfare. We've been part of the Barrios Unidos to end that, and I think it's had some success. And we cover indigenous issues, of the Americas, whether they be English-speaking or Spanish-speaking indigenous communities. We always bring a light to the struggle because as Chicanos, we're indígenas. And that's been the intent of the show, to bring a light to our plight in this country. We're the originals, peoples of these lands, and yet this government, this colonial system of government, the Demo-Publican system, has denied us our humanity and has stripped us basically of our right to our heritage and culture. That's why La Onda has always been about advancing our culture, the advancement of our spiritual culture in this country, and to bring it to the forefront. And here we are, 43 years at Berkeley at KPFA. That's part of the Pacifica Network. And, we continue. We've recently brought in some new segments to transition La Onda to the new generations, because our generations are, are coming to what I call our sunset. But yet the struggle remains. And as Chicanos, as indigenous in this country, we're in a constant struggle. And the show promotes those struggles, brings attention to those plights that we find ourselves in. And Indigenous Peoples Day, Ton, thanks to you, way back 40 years ago, when you said, hey, we need to return back to the Rock. We need to return back to Alcatraz. And you started that kind of movement, and yes, sure enough, we returned back to the Rock, and we brought back what John Trudell started there back in the late 60s, 1969, and that's Radio Free Alcatraz. And collectively through you, myself, La Onda Bajita crew, and Flashpoints, we've been able to do this coverage for the last 30 years. And it's something that you opened the door to, something that you have been very instrumental in bringing us up to speed. And really, Don, I have to thank you and the work that you've done. You awaken in a lot of Chicanos the indigenous blood in us that we have. And now, from the first time we went out to Alcatraz, I think there was maybe 50 of us, and it was raining and storming, and we're out there in the boat.
A bad day.
Bad day, was storming, raining, and I'm sitting in the boat, I'm going, what am I doing here? Yeah, so there was just a handful, less than 100 of us. But that was the beginning. And once I got there, once I participated, once I saw the dance, the drum, it really awakened something. And again, thanks to your efforts, a lot of us, have followed that path that you, in a sense, guided us to. And that is what we call the Red Road. So here we are, getting, into a new century. We're in 2023, and we have a whole new crew coming on board that's going to continue this show and bring Chicano indigenous youth into the mix. As a population, when you add the Chicano and you add the United States and Native Americans, there's probably about 40 million of us in this country. When you look at the Latino population as a whole, there's anywhere from 55 to 60 million. So a good, 40 plus million are indigenous, whether they're Native Americans from the United States or indigenous from the Southwest and the rest of the Americas. And that's one thing that is really instilled pride in us. The show itself has always been targeted in the beginning to take youth away from destructive behavior. In those days, the barrios, the colonias, pueblos were plagued with gang violence. Drive-by shootings. People couldn't go to parks and have a quinceañera. They couldn't have a parque to have a, fiesta. Everybody was always scared. But through the efforts of yourself, AIM, and Barrios Unidos with Nani Alejandres, based out of Santa Cruz, who really worked diligently, I know with you, both of you and Nani Alejandres, developed a peace plan that eventually, I know, Nani Alejandres took to Pelican Bay, and he got the warring factions inside, the leaders, to sign a peace treaty. And since then, Ton, you don't hear about that anymore. You don't hear about drive-bys at quinceañeras. You don't hear drive-bys at fiestas. You don't hear about that kind of stuff. Because Barrios Unidos, AIM West, all that effort, and ourselves covering it really helped deal with that violence. So we've proven that radio, aligned with certain groups and coalitions that are out there promoting Chicano indigenous culture, has really been effective. And radio has been our means to do that. So we've taken youth away from destructive behavior and transformed them, filling them with pride. That's one thing that was lacking. The schools don't teach you history. They don't teach you anything. It's all whitewashed history. But when we started looking at our history, we used to do reflexiones del pasado, reflections of the past, bringing a little note of history. And of course, I majored when I went to university in Chicano studies. So I've always weaved that Chicano indigenous history into our shows. and is really awakened. From that first time we went out to Alcatraz, like I said, it was less than 100. Today, Indigenous Peoples Day has swelled up to, close to 1,000. And if you look at that mix, there's a lot of brown indigenous folks, Chicanos and Spanish-speaking indigenous in those groups. On Thanksgiving in November, there's been close to 7,000. And when you look at those numbers and you look at our Chicano indigenous participation, we have increased by 100-fold. So it's been very, very challenging and at the same time very enriching for us on the cruise to see the impact that radio can have in instilling pride, not just in youth, but in our community. And then advocating for the spiritual advancement of our people, something that I have to thank you for bringing us into that awareness of our indigenous roots and putting us on the red road.
Well, Miguel, that speaks a lot to the history that you have, and you're able to express such as you do. And I think that's what stands out, your effectiveness and your passion, as people call it, or in other terms, but also able to awaken people and help them in the movement forward in all of the various fields that you mentioned, and your involvement in the farm worker community and the UFW, United Farm Workers. Can you share with us a little experience? Because I think that's probably a reflection of your childhood, your upbringing that brings all that into one movement of your individuality.
Like I mentioned to you, I was watching an earlier documentary, La Causa, with the movement with Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta and the farm workers. And I said to you, hey man, I was there. I was 12 years old when my Nino, my padrino, my godfather, two of my father's compadres, and my tío, my uncle, my tío Mundo, picked me up one day. And my mother said, ándale, llévatelos. My mother said, take him. He can learn something. And 4 or 5 hours later, I'm asleep. I wake up and I'm in Fresno. ¿Qué? Excuse me, Deleno. 1966, Don, the day that Cesar Chavez and Dolores launched the first pilgrimage. And for me, it was nervously exciting. I'd never been around so many brown people, Don, without being afraid of the INS, without being afraid of La Migra. In those days, anytime we got together, everybody was always afraid. Hey, man, keep your eyes out. The INS might raid this party. The INS might raid this event. The INS might come and raid the festival. That was always something that everybody was leery. But for me, I was always aware of that because I grew up in the fields of misery. I remember getting sprayed by airplanes, Don. The airplanes would come and just spray us. And we used to be out there with no T-shirts because it was hot. And I remember we used to close our eyes, put our tongues out, and the spray, it tasted like lemon drops. We didn't know, Don. Nobody knew. And we'd be out there, mira, getting a taste of lemon drops, that hard candy. We didn't know. Well, now I do know. But in those days, that's the way it was. And I remember times where we'd see the airplane. We always knew what airplane it was. As soon as we saw that plane that wasn't spraying, La Migra, here comes the INS. Everybody, La Migra. And everybody be alert. And I'll tell you, Don, I can't tell you how many times all of a sudden the men would start running and women would start running into the bushes to get to the rivers. And I remember at times we'd be running with them. Like, why are we running? We'd be running because everybody was running. It was just what used to happen. And so when I was 12 and we went there, was the first time in my life that I wasn't scared. Nobody was scared. And I said, wow, all these Mexicans, all these brown people, and nobody's scared. Everybody's celebrating. Everybody's looking up at the high, not always bent down, with the weight of the world, having to work like we used to call it burro, being, having to work like a beast of burden. That day was a special day for me, and it awakened me. I saw that flag, the Black Eagle. I heard Dolores and I saw Secha speak for the first time, and it just put a fire in me. And yeah, I did come out of the fields of misery. I survived. I call myself a survivor from the fields of misery. And then you look at 1966, and then, last year when the farm workers had another one of their pilgrimage, I participated in it. It was like, 60 years later, here I am again walking for the same things we walked back then. I said, what has changed here? Basically nothing. Whatever we won during the 60s and 70s, we lost. So here I am again, and I'm walking, I'm saying to myself, híjole, really? Here I am walking for what I remember, witnessing when I was a 12-year-old kid. So I walked on. I walked for those that couldn't be there. I walked for those that have died in the fields. Again, what is the reason farm workers take these pilgrimages? For human rights. And for me, it's always been about regaining our human dignity. We're not beasts of burden. We're not animals. We're not savages. We contribute to the development of the Southwest and this country. We're the agricultural machine that feeds not only California, but the nation. We built this agricultural empire here in California with the sweat, the tears, and blood of farm workers. So next time, you're out there shopping, you're getting even at the farmers markets or wherever, remember that food has come at a price from people, and I know this because I grew up in a chicken coop, Don, and I can't tell you the humiliation I used to have to suffer every day going to school. Everybody knew I was the chicken wetback, living in the chicken coop. But I survived it. I endured it. And today, what do I see? Again, we're having to struggle and fight for our humanity and our right to choose our own union, our right to vote, our right to have a voice. As I see it today, that struggle continues, because again, the last Republican president from the Trumplican Party reduced us to animals. When he said, hey, all these Mexicans are murderers, rapists, drug dealers, and animals. Well, that's what I've devoted my life to regain our humanity in this country. To say, hey, without us, you wouldn't eat. Without us, you couldn't raise your kids. Without us, your elderly would be in jeopardy. Because we're domestic workers, we're day laborers, and we're farm workers doing some of the work that nobody else, wants to do. And we're the lowest paid, the less organized, and we're a labor force that this country, this state depends on. And yet, we're at the bottom of the ladder when it comes to economic status or power.
And well, Miguel, of course, we're very fortunate that you mentioned last year was successful in the walk because Governor Newsom did sign.
He did sign the bill. It took him 30 days, and he only signed it, after we finished the walk on the 26th of August, 2023. It took him a month to sign it. And it was only after, I think it was the 26th. I'm not sure, 24th or 26th, where the march ended in August. And it took Gavin a month to sign the bill. And it was only after President Joe Biden made a comment. It's supporting the farm workers, directly challenging Gavin Newsom. And then a couple of days later, Kamala Harris from California that used to work with Gavin Newsom calls him out also. It was only after those two highly profile Democratic leaders called out Newsom that he signed. It wasn't something that came from his heart. He wasn't there to, welcome us when we came there. He wasn't there. Now, when we used to march before on other events with United Farm Workers, Jerry Brown would sometimes march with us. His sister, Kathleen Brown, sometimes would march with us. Gavin Newsom was nowhere to be seen. He was probably eating a special dinner at that place in Napa Valley. where only the rich, some of the richest, fanciest food in the country is, the French Laundry. That's Gavin Newsom's restaurant. And right up the street, about 6-7 miles, is his winery. The guy is a winery owner. He's part owner in this conglomerate that has this vineyard in the Napa Valley. So, he's not going to be for farm workers. We saw what happened about a year or two ago during the firestorm, Stone. In the Napa Valley, you see everybody's evacuated. Everybody's taken out of there, even livestock. Who's left behind? Farm workers. In that toxic air, in that poison environment, with fires on both sides of the valleys, and there's the people still there. They're like, they weren't important enough to evacuate. But the growers, the ranchers, the farmers needed them to stay there to harvest the crop. And we brought attention to that. Really? You're putting workers in jeopardy for your crops and your wine. So we bring a lens to that. We bring the mic. And I've always been one, and people know that. I have a mic, we'll travel. When we get there, Don, just give us a place to flop, to crash, to sleep, and feed us all we can eat. And you ran with us, on Flash Onda, here across the country and elsewhere. That's what we do. We get a call, nobody cares, nobody's doing coverage, the local media, it's not even important to them. You give us a call, we'll figure out how to get there. We'll raise the monies to get there. But once we get there, you got to give us a place to throw down, give us a blanket on the floor, a couch, a cot, or a sleeping bag, and feed us all we can eat. And that's been our motto, and we've done that now for 40 plus years, and we'll continue to do so.
Excuse me, Miguel, just to refer to that just briefly, with the signing of that bill by governor, resolution, or however by the governor allows farm workers to vote.
Oh, the bill, yes.
From home, and have mail in, and allowed without the patron.
Right. You can vote without.
That's a big step forward of farm worker.
Exactly.
But Miguel,
well, one of the things, Tony, if I may say, interrupt, and that's that the bill allows farm workers to be able to vote in a union of their choice in union elections, and can do it from the privacy and the comfort of their home. And that's what that bill allows for people, farm workers, to be able to vote of a union of their choice in the privacy of their homes.
Well, thank you for clarifying that. And Miguel, in the brief time we have, but I'd like to come back at another point for further interview, if you will. But I wanted to ask you the challenges ahead in radio broadcasting for not only Raza, but freedom of voice and free radio broadcasting. And I wanted to ask you, what do you think the challenges are?
Well, I think at this point, we're here 2023. We're about to enter 2025. All this AI, artificial intelligence. Well, one thing that I've always had this idea is that sooner or later, we're going to have to develop our own satellite communication systems as Chicanos. We can't depend on mainstream. We can't depend on corporate, military. We have to develop our own communication systems. And the idea is, one of the segments that we're going to start on La Onda is called The Cosmos. Chicanos in Space, with Daniel Rodriguez. He'll be doing this segment. And it deals with, bringing indigenous and native voices from around the world to give their view of the earth. Well, in that segment, the idea is to eventually, at some point in the future, take a 1950, 1952 or 54 Nomad Chevrolet, get the heating tiles that can withstand the entrance to the atmosphere, and back to the earth, and, raise about $500,000 is going to cost us to be able to launch the satellite into space. And that 54 Chevrolet will be completely redone. Transmission, computers, space to Earth communication, all of that. We'll build our own satellite. Then we'll rent one of these rockets to send it up to space and put us in orbit with a fleet of vans or a fleet of lowriders back and forth taking information and taking that information and broadcasting it up to space, from space transmitting it throughout Aslan. That's basically the idea. At some point in the future, there's going to be a lowrider Chevrolet transmitting information and communication, because right now, as a people, we don't have that. We have a radio station here, we have a radio station there, we have networks here. Radio Bilingüe has about 14 stations across the Southwest. Radio Campesina has, I think, 3 stations in the Valley, and then La Onda. But outside of that, you have Hispanic media, Telemundo, Teleazteca, very Hispanic, very Latino. Well, as Chicanos, we're not either Hispanics or Latinos. We're indigenous. And so in that sense, we don't have those technologies. We don't have those means. So this is the dream. Cosmos, that's the idea. I saw years ago a mural that showed 2 Toltecas in space, and then it shows a U.S. astronaut going, huh? And that's what gave me the idea. So in some ways, Toltenecos, is the idea of setting up our own communication system from satellite to ground and from ground to satellite.
Miguel, thank you very much, and for your cosmic rendition of the global vision of Raza Radio Broadcasting. My relatives, we've heard of the Royal Chicano Air Force down in Santa Cruz on the West Coast. Along the southern coast there, we have the Royal Chicano Navy.
Right.
These are all colectivas.
Right.
And mind you, La Brocha del Valle.
Right.
In the San Joaquin Valley, so here what's the program that?
Los Cosmos.
Los Cosmos.
Chicanos in space.
Yeah, I appreciate your description. And my relatives are coming to the end here on Eagle and Condor with Miguel Gavlian Molina. But, tell your friends about the program, and also to listen into Miguel Molina's radio program, KPFA 94.1 FM. That's Friday nights, and that's for the last 43 years. My relatives, Fridays from 8 to 10. He's been a great voice on those nights and evenings, and la música, whether it's ranchera, lowrider, Chicano music from Los, or however chanclada you appreciate. Miguel's always there, and he's been working with a great crew of people that he recruits and brings on, and he talks about developing the youth, bringing them on, and going on with his vision of his new programming that will affect a lot of people. So I want to thank you very much for that, Miguel. And don't forget, Leonard Peltier still in prison. His birthday was just last September the 12th, at 79 years, my relatives, and 48 of those, he's been incarcerated for a crime he did not commit. And you can call President Joe Biden for immediate clemency, executive clemency, but call the White House, leave him a message at 202-456-1111. That's 202-456-1111. That's it, my relatives. Thank you for watching the program.